A mile south of the bustling centre of Manchester is Hulme, an unassuming part of the city. Hulme, though, was a location of one of the most disastrous social housing experiments in British history. Occupying the area for 2 decades, it was a home of misery and crime. Standing in Hulme today, you could easily be mistaken for thinking it never existed. It's like someone tried to hide any trace of their mistake. No one could have predicted the madness and chaos that unfolded, especially at the beginning, especially when Hulme Crescents were first built. It was the 1950s, and much like the opening to Coronation Street or any Lowry painting, a fair chunk of Manchester consisted of rows upon rows of dense terraced housing, stretching as far as the eye could see. Smog-filled skies, no indoor plumbing or parks for people to enjoy. Conditions in the slums were pretty grim, with many houses being deemed unfit for human habitation. Life for the average Mancunian was actually better in the 17th century than it was in the mid-20th. By the 60s, it was decided that the slums finally had to go. Excited by the prospect of finally getting rid of its slums, Manchester went a tad overboard. Huge swathes of the city were wiped from the map in the blink of an eye. Residents watched as whole areas of Hulme were flattened.
It seemed so quick, it was unbelievable, that we saw all these little houses and streets demolished.
Places they were born and lived in, entire communities destroyed. Manchester Housing Committee now had the unenviable task of rebuilding massive chunks of the city. They didn't want to repeat the mistakes of high-rise tower blocks where communities had been torn apart, so they had to come up with a better solution. In 1965, they enlisted the help of architects Hugh Wilson and Lewis Walmsley, who designed 4 imposing blocks of flats inspired by the Regency terraces in Bath, each 7 stories high and a half a mile long. Linked by double-decker concrete walkways, individual flats were accessible by shared open decks, replicating the old streets of the slums. When the Crescents opened in 1971, people were amazed. The new flats provided modern living conditions they'd never experienced. It was even considered an architectural success. What you don't do when you're designing a massive housing development, brought to you by hindsight. Don't design suburbs 10 minutes walk from a city centre. 2. Don't remove all housing in one go, especially housing that could potentially be renovated. 3. Don't build too quickly on the cheap, things will inevitably go wrong. And 4. Don't build and design without consulting residents, given they're the ones who'll have to live there. With the Crescents, it wasn't just one thing you could pinpoint and say, oh, okay, that's why it didn't work. No, everything that could go wrong did. The communities Manchester tried to protect no longer even existed. Many people moving in were from other areas of the country, not just Hulme, as former residents had been priced out. Industrial units, shops and other businesses were destroyed during Manchester's purge, with no replacements provided. The few pubs and churches that were spared were all but hollow shells, as most of the original clientele and congregations were gone. Factories had been given government subsidies to produce concrete slabs for the Crescents en masse, forcing Manchester to embrace massive-scale factory-produced architecture. And this was obvious. 7 floors of copy and pasted identical modular flats, all made from the same achromatic concrete, blending in with the perpetually grey northern skies. It was a rush job too, done on a budget. Bolts and ties were missing, roofs leaked, winds rattled through poorly fitted windows. Damp became a constant struggle, as residents couldn't afford to run the electric underfloor heating, so pneumonia and bronchitis became a major problem. Adding to this, cockroaches and mice quickly found a home in the Crescents, and the lifts gained second uses as toilets. The voids between and around the Crescents weren't much better, filled with featureless green spaces and sporadically planted saplings. The Crescents rapidly became the worst parts of Hulme. The fact each one was named after one of Britain's most respected architects seemed like some sort of twisted joke. In Bath, the Regency terraces that inspired the Crescents were built for a small number of wealthy families offering spacious living. They're elegant and well built. In Manchester, the Crescents were crammed with nearly 1,000 families, were cheap, utilitarian buildings with minimal features and simplistic forms. Children didn't have anywhere to play except the walkways high up in the sky, the sound reverberating around the Crescents. One child even tragically fell to their death. And only after a few years, 90% of the residents wanted to be rehoused. They moved from one slum right into another.
And it wasn't a dream, this was a nightmare.
Rob, who grew up there, writes, "Kids were oblivious to the horrid conditions like damp and infestation that parents had to cope with. It was a mad place to live though. There were always domestic incidents, fights, drunken arguments, windows going through, etc., which all just seemed normal if you'd never known anything else." The reputation of the Crescent spread. The only people Manchester could house there had no other options. Families suffering with addiction, homelessness and unemployment. This only increased pre-existing problems. Police also didn't patrol the area, not considering the walkways as proper streets. You were 30 times more likely to be murdered or mugged in Hulme than the national average. Women didn't go out at night for fear of being attacked. By the late 70s, it all got too much, and the families moved out of the Crescents, partly to reduce the noise and vandalism, but mainly because they'd become uninhabitable. As families moved out, people less concerned with the grim and dangerous living conditions moved in, students, musicians and artists, brought with them a creative energy. Joy Division played early shows at what would become Factory Records, the label of Happy Mondays and New Order. By 1984, the council, not wanting to deal with the disaster anymore, yet financially not able to tear it down, stopped collecting rents from the occupants. Transient people experimented in art, music and speed. They moved freely from flat to flat. The concrete became a canvas for expression. Gonnie, a former resident, writes, "It was carnivalesque in many ways. It seemed to me a place for dreamers and outcasts. It housed an aspiring and supportive creative community of avid critics, critical of anything and everything. In its last days, as the flats were boarded up, the flats became veritable party spaces."
It is my immense honour to say to all you slum dwellers, your prayers have been answered. Welcome to paradise!
Now home to illegal nightclubs and pirate radio stations. Burnt out cars, litter and debris occupied public spaces like a bohemian wasteland. For the rest of the city, it was an eyesore, an embarrassment that couldn't last forever. And in 1993, demolition finally began. A sort of pagan-esque festival was held on the estate, to paradoxically both mourn and celebrate their destruction. Fireworks, music and drums, massive marionettes dancing in the dark, illuminated by the flames beneath them. And then it was all over. The Crescents came down. For 50 years, wealthier residents had been leaving Manchester in droves, fleeing to the suburbs. They didn't want to live in cities anymore. And as they left, shops, schools and the city as a whole suffered. In the 90s, developers and city planners, for the first time, started listening to the residents and designed homes that offered variation in size, style and ownership, as opposed to the monotony of the Crescents. Plans for a network of cul-de-sacs were quickly scrapped. People wanted the messiness, chaos and congestion of a city, not the sterility of the suburbs. They wanted grid layouts, mixed-use areas, shops, houses, businesses, all rolled into one. The people of Hulme have been forced through a series of experiments, each one a bigger failure than the last.
With the redevelopment that's going on now and previously, I've lost my home 3 times as a result of redevelopment.
Hopefully this time would be a success.